They promised silence, yet history screams with their secrets. The most disciplined minds of the medieval era harbored the most profound, dangerous desires. Close your eyes. Hear the stone walls breathing in the suffocating ritual of devotion. Imagine a life where every door is locked, yet the most terrifying threats come from within. Their vows were eternal, but their sanctuary proved tragically fragile. We begin in the suffocating quiet of the late 13th century, where the promise of a life dedicated to the divine drew thousands of women into the monastic system. Stone walls rose, thick and formidable, intended to shelter the soul from the world's contamination. But these very walls soon became confines. The air inside the cloister was perpetually cool, heavy with the scent of beeswax, old parchment, and the metallic tang of self-imposed discipline. It was a world built on rigorous routine, a precise choreography of prayer and manual labor designed to extinguish the human ego and any trace of earthly attachment. The stakes were absolute: eternal salvation or utter, irreversible ruin. You understand the weight of that choice. You are standing in the scriptorium, the only light source a narrow beam angled through a high leaded window, illuminating dancing dust motes above the oak tables. Your back aches from hours spent hunched over illuminated manuscripts, copying liturgical texts in a near-silent trance. The rhythm of your breathing is monitored, your gaze fixed, your movements governed by the bell, the constant arbiter of the cloister's time. But observe the subtle shift in the silence. It is not merely spiritual quietude. It is the strained, brittle quiet that often precedes a fundamental collapse. Underneath the veneer of pious obedience, the human spirit, by its very nature, demands something more. Weinstein was not only a spiritual retreat, it was an economic entity and a social destination, particularly for daughters of nobility who had no advantageous marriage prospects. This societal pressure introduced an inevitable layer of human complexity into the sacred space. Wealthy dowries funded the convents, but these funds also bought a certain level of subtle privilege and sometimes an unwelcome entitlement. As the 14th century dawned, whispers began to escape the tightly controlled grounds. Rumors of relaxations in the rule, and of a dangerous, growing curiosity about the world they had sworn to abandon. This was the first soft tremor of the downfall. Consider the refectory, the large communal dining hall. It was here, during the enforced silence of mealtimes, where the strict vows of separation first began to fray. Instead of reading scripture aloud, some convents began allowing the reading of secular romances, tales of knights, passion, and courtly love, subtly violating the spiritual dignity of the meal. These stories, smuggled in past the Mother Superior's gaze, planted seeds of forbidden indulgence, provided a vocabulary for longing, a dangerous blueprint for emotions that were meant to have been purified away by prayer and fasting. History shows that when rules bend, they often break violently. You notice a small, highly polished silver crucifix tucked into the sleeve of a sister. It is far too ornate for the monastic uniform, a gift, perhaps, from an admirer before she took the veil, or worse, a clandestine token exchanged during her life inside. The object itself is a silent declaration of resistance. You feel the slow, heavy dread as the discipline that once felt like divine structure begins to feel like a trap. The environment of extreme deprivation, emotional, social, and sensory, begins to reverse upon itself, creating a desperate vacuum where any form of release becomes immensely appealing. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the erosion. The primary ritual focus of the cloistered life was the nightly office, which required the nuns to rise in the deepest hours of the morning for prayer. This darkness, meant for solitary devotion, often became a shield for activities far removed from piety. Reports filtered to the bishops regarding lax security, doors left unbarred, visitors received after sundown. The spiritual violation was becoming physical, blurring the consecrated boundary between the spiritual haven and the secular danger. The very darkness intended to focus their meditation instead became an accomplice to their severe suffering. The greatest symbol of the nun's commitment was her habit, the coarse, heavy wool designed to remind her of mortality and humility. But in certain documented instances, this very uniform was adapted. Rich silks, expensive lace, and even jewelry were sometimes worn underneath the severe outer layers.
a secret rebellion against the poverty vow. These acts were not merely vanity. They represented an internal schism, a rejection of the spiritual architecture that held their world together. The pursuit of these hidden, beautiful objects signaled a catastrophic shift in allegiance from the sacred to the self. Jump forward 2 decades. The discipline has slackened almost beyond recognition in certain houses. You witness a scene that would have been unimaginable to the founding mothers. A communal parlor room filled not with the sound of scripture, but with boisterous laughter and the clatter of dice. Gambling, drinking, and even theatrical performances, using the cloister as a private stage for worldly dramas, became commonplace. The rigorous separation from the world, the defining rule of their existence, had effectively vanished. The cloister, designed as a fortress against sin, had inadvertently concentrated it. The deepest betrayal of the ritual life centered around the vows of chastity. While the church records use euphemistic language referring to the scandals of the flesh and forbidden indulgence, the historical record is clear. The isolation and proximity created conditions ripe for emotional and physical attachments, both internal among the sisters and external with male visitors or priests. These violations of dignity were not always consensual, reflecting the stark power dynamics and the lack of external oversight that plagued these enclosed communities. The purity of the ritual had devolved into a complex, painful crisis of power. Imagine the chapter house, usually the site of self-denunciation and correction. Instead, it became the locus of bitter factionalism and infighting. Those who maintained the strict rule were ostracized or subtly persecuted by the majority who sought liberty. The air was thick, not with incense, but with resentment and fear. The silence was now weaponized, used to hide secrets rather than facilitate prayer. The soft reveal here is the recognition that the destruction was fundamentally self-inflicted, born from the pressure cooker environment of absolute control. You realize that the spiritual authority of the Mother Superior is now purely nominal, enforced only by fear of exposure, not genuine respect. The system that was meant to protect these women, providing them with education, status, and spiritual solace, had instead become a fertile ground for their ethical collapse. When devotion is mandatory, it is often fragile. When control is absolute, resistance finds the darkest corners to flourish. What came next changed everything. The most severe instances often led to the direct intervention of the local bishop or papal inquisitors. The external purge was swift and often brutal in its finality. The Church demanded exemplary consequences to maintain its external facade of moral authority. When the corruption was deep-seated, the actions taken were drastic. The entire community might be condemned, dispersed, or even physically walled up entirely to prevent further social and spiritual contamination. The institutional response aimed to eliminate the scandal, not cure the underlying human causes. Pensions the Inquisitor's records speak of severe suffering and public degradation imposed upon the most vocal transgressors. The silence that follows such interventions is profound, a silence not of peace, but of enforced terror. The historical accounts of the dissolution of certain houses, like the infamous episodes in the Low Countries, reveal a rapid, terrifying shift from forbidden indulgence to total institutional purge. It is a cautionary tale of how quickly a sacred space can become a site of intense human conflict. Walk through the cold corridors after the intervention. All color is gone. The few remaining sisters move like ghosts, and the strict rule is reimposed with an unforgiving iron hand. The original purpose of the cloister, spiritual refinement, is irrevocably tarnished by the memory of profound ethical failure. You understand the vulnerability inherent in any human system that relies entirely on absolute denial and isolation. The human spirit, when
Caged, will invariably find destructive ways to break free. The legacy of these documented downfalls was twofold. First, they provided endless fodder for anti-clerical sentiment in the centuries that followed, fueling the Reformation's criticisms of institutional corruption. Second, and perhaps more tragically, they led to even more rigorous, oppressive controls placed upon future generations of women religious, cementing the very conditions, extreme isolation and lack of oversight, that had instigated the collapse in the first place. The history of the enclosed nunneries is a grim loop of human failing and escalating reaction. We look back, not to sensationalize, but to understand the pressure points of historical power structures. The history of the cloister reveals that when the boundary between the sacred and the worldly is artificially rigid, the inevitable blending of the two can be explosive. These walls, meant to keep the world out, ultimately served only to amplify the human frailty contained within. The tragedy lies in the fact that the quest for ultimate purity often leads directly to the most catastrophic forms of human corruption. The material evidence left behind by these condemned communities offers silent testimony to the severity of the institutional violations. Archaeological findings often reveal unexpected, non-religious objects buried beneath floorboards or within wall cavities, tiny mirrors, fragments of silk, or mundane tools used for clandestine communication. These artifacts paint a picture of individuals who were desperate to retain some connection to personal identity and agency, battling the overwhelming force of monastic denial. The severity of the spiritual discipline simply birthed a compensating severity of material obsession. Imagine the complex web of emotional bonds became intensely amplified. Simple friendships transformed into deep, sometimes dangerously possessive attachments due to the lack of external outlets. You perceive the psychological intensity of being perpetually surrounded by the same faces, the same routine, day after day, year after year. The environment became a hothouse for both spiritual devotion and profound, emotionally complex breakdowns. This internal landscape was the real site of the ultimate institutional conflict. The medieval perception of sound and silence plays a critical role in understanding the downfall. Silence was a virtue, but it was also a perfect cloak. Confessionals, meant to be instruments of cleansing, were sometimes exploited for the transference of private information or the manipulation of those under the superior's control. The small, heavily grated windows used for these exchanges became, paradoxically, points of deepest vulnerability. The Church struggled to govern sins that were whispered, not shouted, making definitive proof nearly impossible until the situation had reached a point of catastrophic disarray. Alleviate. Even the liturgy, the heart of their ritual life, was sometimes subverted. Accounts exist of nuns altering traditional chants or injecting secular verses into the sacred texts during private services. This quiet, musical rebellion was a profound act of defiance against the imposed spiritual identity. It demonstrates that the rejection of the rule was often multifaceted, intellectual, emotional, and ritualistic. The cloister thus became a mirror, reflecting the deep, unresolved tensions of the broader medieval church itself. You read the letters of one abbess, written decades before the collapse, warning the local bishop about the dangers of accepting too many novices without genuine spiritual calling. Her prophecy was ignored. She understood that enforced spirituality is inherently unstable. When the religious commitment is merely a social convenience, the sanctuary inevitably transforms into a social prison where forbidden indulgence becomes the only perceived route to momentary freedom. The issue of health and healing within the cloister also contributes to the narrative of collapse. Convents were centers of herbal medicine, and their proximity to powerful, mind-altering substances, used for both medicine and spiritual contemplation, presented unique dangers. The blurring of lines between genuine healing, self-medication for anxiety, and deliberate alteration of consciousness contributed to the atmosphere of severe suffering and moral ambiguity that characterized the declining houses. Consider the altar itself. In the most extreme documented cases of moral collapse, accounts speak of non-religious objects being placed or hidden near the sacred vessels, love tokens, gambling chips, or bottles of wine. These items, juxtaposed against the consecrated symbols of devotion, embody the psychological intensity of the schism within the community. The sacred and the profane had not just overlapped, they had violently merged, demanding an institutional purge. Step back now from the immediacy of the scandal and view the long arc of history. The tragic ends of these compromised houses serve as a permanent caution. They remind you that no wall is high enough to exclude human fallibility, and no rule is strict enough to govern the unpredictable depths of the human heart when it is denied fundamental dignity and agency. The shadows they left behind are long, but their stories are essential for understanding the true cost of power and suppression. Policing. The The ruins of these convents still stand today in various corners of Europe, silent witnesses to the turbulent human drama played out within their confines. They are monuments to the quiet historians who piece together the fragments of pain, devotion, and eventual downfall. The moss grows over the broken stone, softening the edges of the tragedy. Yet the severe suffering endured by the women caught in this historical current remains sharply etched in the archives. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict, without depicting explicit or graphic events. Ultimately, the medieval convent system, at its worst, was a demonstration of how good intentions, the pursuit of holiness, could be warped by systemic failure and the enforcement of extreme isolation. The downfall was not a sudden accident, but a slow, inevitable outcome of psychological and social pressures compressed into a physically inescapable space.